Welcome to Making Things Right, where we are rethinking the Christian response and responsibility to LGBTQ+ people. I'm your host, Brian Nitzel. If you're tired of the debates and division around faith, sexuality, and gender, if you're ready for more productive ways to engage and solution together and finding our Christian common ground and loving our LGBTQ+ neighbor, then I think this is for you. So welcome to the table and welcome to Making Things Right. If you've been around this conversation at all, you've likely heard of Matthew Vines, a true pioneer who brings a sound biblical case for same-sex relationships. His 2014 book, God and the Gay Christian, was a game changer that drew huge media attention, and a decade later, his work remains as relevant as ever. In this episode, you'll hear about his organization, the Reformation Project, and what I especially loved about our conversation is just getting to know the man behind the mission. So join me in getting to know the work and the person of Matthew Vines. So my first encounter with you, Matthew, was at the Reformation Project conference last October. I was intimidated to come. I'm not sure why. And it was just wonderful. I just felt like I was intimidated because I'm not much of a theological guy. And I felt like I just really wanted to know what you were about. I knew all these people that were part of your cohorts and ambassadors. And I was just very curious about all of it and was just... I really came away, I was impressed with a lot, but really impressed with how you just mobilize people and equip people to do this work at a ground level. It's not all about, you can't be everywhere, right? And it's just the whole approach to the ministry of mobilizing and equipping people was just so wonderful. And I think you and your ministry and your voice and your book, even from 10 years ago, was as vibrant as ever. And just really appreciate you having you on the call tonight.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me, Brian.
So we're going to eventually dive into some good spicy questions well, they're not that spicy, but good questions from people. But I thought we'd start with just getting to know you. I remember even when we were talking and preparing for this, you started unpacking a little bit of your personal story of growing up and your family and church and faith experiences, or when you came out. And, if you could just give us a little bit of, the story behind the story of Matthew, just to start.
Yeah, well, I'll try to keep it brief since I know we've got a lot to get through, but I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, in a conservative Presbyterian church. I was raised in a Christian home by two wonderful parents, and the main thing they wanted to pass on to my sister and me was their love for Jesus and their faith. And I thought they did a really great job of modeling what that looked like in their lives and the value of keeping God and Jesus at the center of your life, your relationships, the way you treat other people. And so that was a very natural thing for me to want to embrace and make central to my life. So from a very young age, I asked Jesus into my heart to be my Lord and Savior. And that has always defined the core of my worldview, my understanding of who I am and my place and purpose in the world. My faith in and love for Jesus has always been that foundation for me. And overall, I had a positive experience growing up in our church, which was not an affirming church because, this was, the 1990s, and that was a much less common thing at the time.
Sure.
But I didn't even know that gay people existed until I was in middle school. So it's not something that, same-sex marriage didn't begin to be a big national debate until I was in middle school. So it's not even something I was aware of until then. It's not something that was being preached on. It was almost a non-issue altogether.
Small town a little bit too, probably,
no,
right?
It was Wichita. So Wichita is the largest city in Kansas because most of Kansas City is in Missouri. So it's about 500,000 people. So it's not too small.
Not small town,
but
sorry.
It was a non-issue, ironically, not in the sense that people were okay with it, but in the sense that no one was okay with it. And so therefore, it was not an issue because it's not something that was being debated or discussed. But I remember then I first realized that gay people existed in middle school. There began to be some people in my high school who were openly gay, and none of them were Christian or came from Christian backgrounds. But I did feel some tension just internally and feeling like I knew that they felt pretty alienated from the church and that they felt pretty rejected by the church.
Sure.
And I think the posture that I took was just that, as Christians, we're just called to love and focus on love. And whether it's a sin or not, I just want to be focused on loving people. But by the time I went to college, I went to Harvard, which is in Massachusetts. So kind of half the country away, very different climate, context. This was at the time, Massachusetts was one of only two states in the United States that recognized same-sex marriage
And at
legally.
that time, you weren't out or even thinking of yourself as gay or any of
No,
that stuff, right?
no,
Okay, that's what I thought.
I was still committed to trying to be straight. And because I couldn't even fathom, I mean, that wasn't even an option to even consider in my
Sure.
mind. So it's not that I wasn't attracted to the same sex. I think I would just choose to interpret that in a different way.
Mhm.
Because if you've never been anyone other than yourself, how do you know that maybe that's just what everyone is doing? Everyone is actually secretly attracted to the same sex, but they're just working hard not to be. You know, in theory, everyone could be
Yeah.
doing that because if I'm not telling people, no one else is telling people. In
Yeah.
theory, this could be what is going on with everyone. Obviously, it's not really very logical or rational, but you can make believe you can make yourself believe all kinds of things that you need to in order to
Survive. Yeah.
be at peace with
Yeah.
things. And so you just kind of shove down any awareness of that, or just decide that that's not what that is, or that that's really not different than what anyone else experiences, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And that really doesn't mean that you are gay. But by the time I then went to college, I still, again, had shoved that deep down, but I was feeling increasingly conflicted just over what I had been taught growing up about same-sex relationships. But I
Yep.
was even feeling conflicted over the more neutral posture that I had adopted toward the topic because I began to see just through relationships and not even particularly close relationships, but just people I was meeting and hearing their stories of people who came out as gay when they were 16 and got kicked out of their Christian home and
Hmm.
family. And the number of people who, whether they were gay or not, had no interest in Christianity in significant part due to the fact that the way they had seen their friends who were gay be treated by the
Yep.
church. And so they had this kind of fierce protective attitude
Yeah.
toward their friends who were being treated poorly for something about them that was different. And I
Hmm.
thought, this is so unfortunate that that's the reason why you're not interested in Jesus, because I
Yeah.
actually feel like that's a great quality for someone who wants to be a follower of Jesus.
Right. Right. Right.
That quality of caring about people who are being like wrongly excluded and left out and poorly treated, especially just because about something about them that is different. And I just thought this is so topsy-turvy. You know, if the reason why people weren't interested in Christianity was because they had heard the gospel and just decided that, you know, they didn't like the message of Jesus, they didn't like what Jesus stood for and what he taught, well, then
Yeah.
at least they'd be rejecting it for what it was. But it felt like so many people were rejecting Christianity for kind of Christian reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That their reasons for walking away from the church were actually rooted in a lot of basic Christian attitudes and beliefs. So I just thought this is very wrong. Something about this is not adding up. So I ended up doing Bible study with some other students in the Christian ministry that I got involved in on campus. And I came to believe that things were not as black and white as I had once thought when it came to the main six passages in scripture that refer to forms of same-sex behavior. I just didn't think that the non-affirming position opposed to all same-sex relationships was nearly as strong as I had once thought, just based on the theological and biblical arguments. So I
Right.
eventually changed my mind and actually I felt passionate about the topic. I felt passionate that this was a really important thing for the church to get right
And
because
didn't
the
you
church,
actually leave school for a while to like have more
not
time
yet,
to deep dive in it? Not yet. Okay.
not yet.
Yep.
So I became passionate about the topic and felt like the church was needlessly shooting itself in the foot, right? If you are taking an unpopular position that is losing you a lot of people, a lot of young people, but you are really standing for the truth, and it is the truth, then that's a noble thing. But if you're taking a position that's losing you a lot of people and the position is actually faulty, then that's a completely different situation
Mm-hmm.
because that we should then say, wait a second, we don't want to be alienating so many people if the reason that we're alienating them is actually not grounded in the truth, but is
Mm-hmm.
grounded in something that is off. I felt passionately that the church really needs to get this right because we are losing a whole generation over something that, and I don't think it's the intentions may be noble, but I still think at the end of the day, if it's not actually, if the stand you're taking isn't rooted in truth, then that's a really unfortunate reason
Right. Right.
to be losing a whole generation. But I actually also, at the time, I thought, well, this would be unfair. So I wouldn't say this publicly, but I thought I kind of wish that some gay person, when they came out, would just kind of stick around and help explain how to understand the main 6 Bible verses in this conversation. Because I thought, here I am as, a Christian who is trying to understand this, but it's still, I felt like a lot of the resources that I found were helpful in certain ways, but not in every way. And too many of the resources that I found were written from a more explicitly theologically progressive direction. And what I mean by that is specifically a direction that is not committed to the authority of the Bible. So I would read some resources that might have some good facts in them, that might even have some valid insights from biblical scholarship, but then would say in the next verse, well, who really cares what Paul wrote because we don't agree with Paul? And I was like, hold up.
Yeah.
That's not my belief. That's not how I was taught to read the Bible. That's not what I believe about the Bible.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested in simply saying I'm going to set aside or dismiss parts of scripture, but I do think that, I want to understand these things better. I want to understand these verses in their appropriate historical and cultural context. And I do believe that if you do that, you can still arrive at a position that makes room for committed same-sex relationships, but not in a way that sets scripture aside or any part of scripture aside. And so I remember I went to YouTube and I wanted to find an hour-long talk that just broke down how to understand these main Bible verses from a theologically conservative standpoint that was upholding the authority of the Bible, and I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, it'd be really nice if some gay person, when they were coming out, would do that. But obviously, that would seem I wouldn't say that. It sounds insensitive because they're dealing with a lot. They're going through a lot of rejection. So I totally get it.
Yeah.
Anyway, fast forward to my sophomore year at college, and I eventually then after this 6 months or something after I became passionate about this topic, it gave me the room to stop kind of burying so deep a lot of those things that I could have processed years earlier had I been open to it, but I hadn't been open to it. And I think I probably had to change my mind before I could even be open to thinking about that. I was not happy at all about this understanding, which was obvious once I was willing to acknowledge it. But I realized, wait a second, why am I so unhappy about this? Because I already spent all this time last year studying this and researching this, and I already concluded that I don't think that this is a sin. So why am I so unhappy about this? So anyway, I kind of worked through that. I realized I just don't want to deal with the way that this is going to upend my life. And I know that my parents are not in the same place. My parents were at a different, more conservative view on the topic. And I just thought, and it made me question, will I have a place in the church, going forward, all these things. So I wasn't happy.
Maybe in a little classically of the, like, you can talk about something for other people, but once it becomes really personal, it's like a whole different level of buy-in.
It's like, oh, I was excited to be an advocate for other people, but I did not want to go through this. But then I realized, you know what? I did think it would be nice if a gay person helped to.
So I guess that's going to be me.
I was like, so I should probably do that now because I'm in a pretty good position.
That's fascinating though, because if I would have guessed, I would have guessed the chicken came before the egg, not the other way around. So it's just a cool part of your story.
Then I took a semester off from college to first come out to my parents. And then I wanted to take my studies to a whole deeper level.
How'd it go with your parents, if I can ask?
Well, they were very loving, but it was quite shocking. And I wouldn't say either one of them I did not get like a coming out celebration, right?
Right.
And in particular, my dad was very convinced that same-sex relationships were sinful. But and he also at the time, he wanted me to be open to maybe some kind of conversion therapy program or approach, because he had heard before of stories of people who went from gay to straight, or at least that's what it sounded like. And so he figured like, well, this is then the answer. Because he said, why would God make someone gay and then not allow them to ever express that? He said that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so maybe you're not really gay in a permanent way. This might be a short-term challenge or struggle, but it's something I think you could overcome. And so, whereas my perspective was, yes, why would God make people gay if you're never allowed to express this? And so I guess there are two possible answers to that, right? One might be that you're not
dad's plan or your hunch.
Right. Or it might be that maybe it is okay to be gay. And so there's two different ways of trying to resolve that tension. the reason I took a semester off from college is I really prioritized my close relationship with my parents. I wanted to maintain that, and I knew that this was going to
Cool.
be this was an important and very challenging issue to come up in our relationship. And so
Yeah.
I wanted to understand the Bible. I had studied it, but I wanted to study it even more. I wanted to understand it even more deeply and really continue to refine and challenge my own thinking on the topic. So, and I knew that I would have, my dad was right there ready to be challenging me. And so he was willing to, and to his great credit, he had a strong belief, but I would say he was still open-minded in the sense that he was willing to hear me out and to consider my perspective, but he wanted me to also be willing to hear him out and consider his perspective, which is understandable and reasonable. And he was hoping I would change my mind. I was hoping he would change his mind. But it was what was good about it is that it wasn't rooted in some kind of, it's not like either one of us, the goal was to win, right? The goal was to come to an understanding of what is true, right? To come to the best discernment of God's will for my life and other people's lives, and to continue to prioritize our relationship. I think that helps a lot. The goal is not to try to win a debate or to win an argument. The goal is to seek truth and to prioritize love and relationship. And through that process, my dad did end up changing his mind because even though he did have strong beliefs about it, he acknowledged early on that he had never done a deep study of the topic. And so as we did that, we first started, kind of with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I don't have to get into in tremendous detail tonight. I know we have limited time, but that was the first text where he realized that, okay, what's going on here is a threatened act of violence. And it's a terrible thing, but what does that have in common with the sort of relationship that I would like to have one day? And so I think that was the first text where he realized, okay, he had previously understood that text to say that all same-sex relationships are wrong. But then when he was going back to the text, not trying to reach a positive conclusion, but just asking a more specific question. He used to just be asking the question, does the text refer to same-sex behavior? And if so, is it positive or negative? And so that question doesn't distinguish between different types of same-sex behavior. It all kind of gets lumped into the same category. After I came out to him, he was just asking a more specific question, which is, what does this text have to say about the sort of committed same-sex marriage relationship that Matthew would like to have? He still was not trying to reach a positive answer. He was just trying to understand it. And that's where
what would have to precede that, though, is an openness or a curiosity. Was he always that way, or did he become more so because he had skin in the game with you?
Oh, well, I think he always has had an open-mindedness about him, but if it had just been some random person who challenged his viewpoint, I doubt he would have been as interested in spending so much time and energy reconsidering it. I think the relationship was really important to that he valued the relationship with me and therefore was willing to, because it's quite the emotional investment as well. Being willing to say, okay, I'm going to try to consider a different viewpoint on a topic that's a big deal. And it's a big deal for a lot of reasons, one of which is that if he was an elder at our church, and if he was going to change his mind on this topic, he probably wouldn't be able to be an elder anymore. He probably wouldn't feel as comfortable or welcome at that church anymore, where he and my mom had gotten married 25 years before. And all of these things. So I do think that the relationship was a critical component there, but also there are some parents who have that relationship, but they're just not willing to even consider another perspective. And so I think it's both of those things. It's both the relationship and also some of his own positive personality traits of that willingness to consider another viewpoint that is then activated through a relationship.
Yeah, that's great. So fast forward a little bit, how did that evolve into the book that you wrote 10 years ago on the Reformation Project and turning this more from a curiosity into a mission and an outward thing? Like, how did that evolve?
Yes. So essentially, I came out to my parents. This is end of 2009, beginning of 2010. I did go back to school for one semester, but then I came back home. And by that point, my parents had fully changed their minds, but I wanted to try to expand the conversation to other people in our church. This was a church of about 2,000 people. Nobody had ever come out and tried to stay before. And I wouldn't say it was particularly successful because I think there's a limit to what can be done when you're one person in a church that large. But I did learn a lot from the experience. I wouldn't say I had fun, because you're having a lot of one-on-one, one-on-two conversations, oftentimes with, longtime family friends, people who helped raise you in church, people who your parents have been friends with for decades. And sometimes the conversations went all right. Sometimes they did not go well. And I know that wasn't fun for my parents either when they're wondering, is this longtime family friend, will they still be friends with us? Most of the time, the answer is yes. Not always, though, unfortunately. That's because they also then, there were some friends finding out that my parents were choosing to support me who felt that they were making the wrong decision. I think it was a challenging process, but it was very still helpful. I ended up, writing a long paper and shared it with other people at the church. And I certainly got good feedback, right? For people who did not agree, who were saying,
Right.
okay, you're saying this part, this makes sense. I don't agree with this, that sort of thing. Anyway, what I wanted to do is I wanted to give a talk, because when I had gone to YouTube earlier, on my own, I wanted to find that an hour-long video,
Right, which you found them. Right.
Right, I couldn't find it. So I wanted to give a talk and post it on the internet to create that resource that I had wished existed. And so the church I grew up in, I ended up having to move on because it became clear that there was just going to be a limit to the conversations I
Sure.
could have there. But there was a different church in town that was willing to let me give a talk on a talk on this topic. And so I recorded that, posted it on YouTube. It was 67 minutes long, but it ended up getting over 1 million views. Then that's what led to my book deal. But also it's at the same time, it's what led to me starting the Reformation Project, because I had experienced two important kind of missing links when I was trying to come out. One was this issue of accessible theological resources, right? So that's what I sought to help create through first the video and then the book. But the
Yeah.
other was any kind of organizational backing or support for people who wanted to stay in their churches that weren't affirming, in order to be a positive voice for greater inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And because too often I felt like the message that I was hearing, even from the broader secular LGBT movement, was that if you were gay and in a conservative Christian context in the Midwest, you should just leave. You should just move to the East Coast or the West Coast and start life over again. I didn't like that message at all, because while I do think Boston is a great city, it's not home to me, right?
It shouldn't be their only option, right?
No,
Yeah.
I didn't want to start my life over and just say, like, for so many reasons. And I just thought that's to me not an encouraging or hopeful message.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't have to be the case and also the flip side of that is that this is one of the biggest reasons why people are leaving the church today.
Right.
And that's, for somebody for whom my faith in Jesus is the most important part of my life, that's a painful thing to see. So I did the video and the book first to try to just help create those resources, more accessible resources. And I started the organization, the Reformation Project, to try to help create more organizational support for Christians who want to be more effective voices for greater inclusion in their own churches. So that's the gist there.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that's great. Well, let's not skip over I want to ask you some questions from folks, but before I do that, give us just a quick on, like, what does the Reformation Project do? Like, what's the mission? I mean, we're getting the point of it, but like, what are you doing? And like, how do you mobilize people? What are you focused on today? Just kind of the state of Reformation Project.
Yes. So the Reformation Project, we are a Bible-based Christian nonprofit organization that works to advance LGBTQ inclusion in the church. And all of that is under the umbrella of our 3 core values, which are love for God, love for the Bible, and love for the church. We have 2 additional values that flow out of those. One is monogamy and covenant, and the other one is diversity and inclusion. But everything is about that love for God, the Bible, and the church. And I think that's so important, because that's really easy for a lot of people who have been hurt by the church to want to see change in the church, but only from a place of hurt and wanting to prevent hurt to others.
Yep.
And while those are good motives, if your only motive for seeking change is to reduce harm, you are much more likely to develop an us versus them attitude toward people in the church who don't agree with you, because you will see them as the purveyors of harm and yourself as the preventer of harm. And so it's really easy then. It's like, I'm the good person, they're the bad people. And as the good person or the good group, we need to try to stop the bad people, or at least mitigate the badness that they are doing.
Yes.
And I think that approach is not ultimately what we need.
Yep.
So I think it's very important that people who are seeking to do this kind of work in the church are coming primarily from a place of shared beliefs and values. That we want to see change in the church because we love God, because we love Jesus, because we love and believe in the Bible, because we love and want the best for the church. And we have all of those beliefs in common with everyone else in the church, no matter what their belief on this topic is. And so if you're able to focus on these shared beliefs and values, it can help to turn the temperature down a little bit in the conversation. So it doesn't feel like it's an existential question of we're either going to take an affirming view on same-sex relationships and also then potentially let go of all these basic Orthodox Christian beliefs about God, Jesus, the Bible, or we'll keep all those basic Orthodox Christian beliefs by maintaining an opposition to same-sex relationships. I think that's many more conservative Christians have long perceived this conversation, which is understandable because there are people who take an affirming view who also want to deconstruct a very broad range of Christian beliefs, including many first order doctrinal
kind of burn it all down.
Yes. And so I think it's just so important for the Reformation Project, for the work that we do, that we're not doing this work. Yes, a lot of people have been hurt by the church. They know and love people who've been hurt by the church. And that it's great for people to care about that, right? And want to make a change to that. But ultimately, our work is not rooted in resentment. It's not rooted in bitterness, and it's not rooted in anger. It's rooted in a shared love, right? And love for the church includes loving people who don't agree, loving people who have a different view. So then what the Reformation Project does practically, we run a variety of programs. We put out, so we have programs for pastors, for parents. We have a leadership development cohort, which is it's our most intensive program. That's for any Christian who wants to become a more effective advocate, especially in a non-affirming church environment. And then people who go through that program, many of them then go on to serve as local ambassadors of the organization. So when we have individuals reach out to us looking for support, as wanting to have conversations, resources, and guides, we connect them.
Somebody on the
with our
ground.
ambassadors, who are just an amazing group of people from all over the world. We put together a lot of theological resources that we create. We have a biannual conference called the Reconcile and Reform Conference. So those are kind of some of the highlights of what we do.
I love that. Well, let's transition into some questions, and I'll kind of lead with ones that were right in line with what you were talking about. Big question, but what do you've been at this more than 10 years, but publicly for 10 years. What's the state of the church and the Reformation, as you call it, today? Like, what's changed over those 10 years? What's working? Where do you see signs of hope? What's not working? Where does the work remain? What do you see the state of the church and kind of what's evolved or not in the last 10 years from you doing this work more publicly?
It's a great question, and I'm sure you won't be shocked that there's both good things and less good things. So I do think that there have been significant positive changes since 2012 when I first gave that talk. You've seen it. I mean, certainly you've got Presbyterians, now the Methodists, and pretty much all the mainline denominations that have now changed their policies and their teachings to be much more inclusive. But and even in the evangelical church, we've definitely seen some important positive movement, right? You see like some of the Amy Grant, a couple years ago about how she was hosting her niece's same-sex wedding. We've seen other positive movement, even at some mega churches that have been seeking to have a much more inclusive posture. So Richard Hayes, the most influential American New Testament scholar, who just announced earlier this year that he has now changed his view on
6 months,
same-sex relationships.
just recently.
So I think you can just look at polls and at numbers as well that show increased support for same-sex marriage among weekly churchgoers, among self-identified evangelicals, especially among younger evangelicals. So there are a lot of things that are positive. And at the same time, part of a broader trend that we've seen in our society is increasing polarization, right? Things are as bad as they've been in a long time. Culturally, in terms of people feeling the strong pull to pick one of two tribes and then go to a metaphorical war against the other tribe and want the other tribe to essentially just be completely defeated rather than having a vision of trying to live in any kind of harmony across some significant disagreements. So to the extent that that then is reflected in the church, I do think there have been challenges where some people on quote unquote the affirming side, I know the sides language is non-ideal, but some people with an affirming view have wanted to push kind of as far as possible in a progressive direction.
Yeah,
And
like anything short of 100% is unacceptable, basically, right?
well, there are two ways of doing it, right? So one is
Yep.
just the posture, where it can be anybody who doesn't agree, you are actually a bad person. And the way to deal with people who don't agree, deal with them, right? Is you deal with them by shouting them down, naming and shaming, calling people out, like very much like you have blood on your hands, and therefore we are justified in treating you very in often kind of bullying and very harsh and even mean ways because our cause is just, therefore our means are just. Now, that's hardly unique, and that's not unique to any one side of any conversation, to
Sure,
be sure. That's a very human tendency. But
Yep.
to the extent that has shown up some, especially through social media, I don't think that's helpful at all, or consistent with who we're called to be as Christians. And again, this is not most affirming Christians at all, right? I think social media gives a megaphone to sometimes the most extreme voices in any group, and then it makes the entire group seem more extreme than it actually is. And this is true on almost any topic that
Sure.
and so then it's also for people who don't agree with the group, it's easy then for the most extreme people on the other side to say, hey, look, these people, we're going to now highlight the most extreme people with the other position so that even if you're uncomfortable with how we seem maybe a bit extreme ourselves, well, isn't this better than that? And so it's both extremes feed off of one another in really counterproductive ways. So some of it's the posture. Other things is, sometimes there's been some people, and again, it's a pretty small minority of people, but they can be vocal and have an impact. People saying, oh,
Yes.
we should now be pushing for things like polyamory, like having relationships with multiple people simultaneously, and that this should all be put under the LGBTQ umbrella. We could get into that. I think that's a very bad idea for a lot of reasons. It has absolutely nothing to do with sexual orientation or gender identity. It's not an LGBT related topic. And I think
I say at minimum, what's wrong about that is saying that just because I'm LGBTQ, I share that belief system, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, but I understand if your goal was to gain support for anything that isn't very popular, well, you want to attach it to something that is more popular. This is a tried and true tactic of all people. So it's understandable why people who would want to advocate for something would want to attach it to something that's more popular. The problem is that if people are trying to attach to our cause a cause that not just is less popular, that's not the issue. The issue is that it is a bad idea and it is ultimately harmful. It is harmful to communities in particular when you try to say that marriages shouldn't be exclusive anymore. And again, it is a small minority of affirming Christians who would hold that view. It really is not the mainstream view at all. But those sorts of things can be given a large voice through social media platforms. So that sort of thing, I'll put all that together. I think it is one of many things that can then contribute to, we've seen a doubling down in the other direction where many conservative churches are wanting to kind of batten down the hatches and say there shouldn't even be any room for conversation on this topic. When the Unconditional Conference happened last year, some of the very harsh backlash to that, right? That conference was not taking an affirming position on same-sex relationships. That was not the point of that conference. It was taking a position of promoting relationship, right? Promoting a general posture of greater welcome. And I think most people actually find that to be a positive thing.
Yeah.
For those who are feeling like we must double down on this, anybody who's saying anything about greater welcome and even an accepting posture toward people can be seen as undermining that cause. And so you've seen a doubling down, and I think that in the more conservative direction as well. And so I think that polarization has been a challenge because the best argument for somebody who takes a very absolutist posture against same-sex relationships and feeling like there should be absolutely no room for differing opinions or differing beliefs. And if anybody has a differing opinion, then they need to be completely shunned and told that they're not even a Christian. The best argument for that view and for that very absolutist posture is the people who want to say there should be no boundaries anymore. We
Yeah.
should tear down the entire Christian sexual ethic.
Right.
And we should basically say anything consensual goes. Yes, there have been some really positive changes that have been good. And the biggest challenge is the polarization that has contributed to these extreme kind of warring factions. And so that's part of why I think it's very important, like the Reformation Project, we take a position that is both affirming and orthodox. We are deeply committed to upholding the authority of the Bible and to Orthodox Christian theology on basic things, thinking about the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, that we believe in the triune God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that we believe that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, that he died for our sins, that he was physically raised from the dead, that he is coming again. And so I think we've felt it to be important to really be clear around this is the core of our beliefs and shared beliefs that we are not changing. And we're quite clear we don't want to change, that we think are very important to hold on to.
Yeah.
Because I do think that at the end of the day, most people want a posture that is broadly accepting and supportive of people while remaining very committed to just the basics of what it means to be a Christian and living that out in an anchored way, not just kind of a kind of free for all, live your truth kind of.
And I my experience, I would entirely agree with that too. And a lot of times I just say, don't let the headlines fool you. Like it may get a lot of noise and news, but I don't think that it represents the majority. So that's actually really encouraging to hear that. Let's take a little more of a personal approach.
Yes.
There were a couple of questions that were closely related to each other. So I'll give you both of them and you can answer whichever one you want. Somebody asked, how can non-affirming Christians be encouraged to see the good in same-sex relationships? And or how do I help my non-accepting family come to a place where we can agree to disagree? You can take either or both.
Great questions. I mean, I think it does depend on whoever you're talking to. There's not necessarily a cookie cutter approach. Things can vary a lot based on who particular people are, where they're coming from, how strongly they hold their views, whether they're trying to hold their views in a loving way or whether they're holding their views in a harsher way.
Right.
But I do think that it can be helpful to go back to Galatians 5, just the list of the fruit of the Spirit, to ask all of these things: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control. Like, do you see these qualities in same-sex relationships? I remember I actually had a conversation with, this was a pastor years ago, who said, well, okay, admittedly, I think they're all pretty much there except for the self-control one, because if it's a sin, then that wouldn't be self-control. I was like, okay, I'll give you that.
Isn't that like 8 out of 9 though, or something like that?
Right, 8 out of 9. Now, I don't think same-sex relationships are inherently lacking in self-control, but I understand that if you thought that they are categorically sinful, then it would seem like there was a self-control problem there.
I love that piece about the fruit, though. That's a great point.
Right, but he basically said, okay, you do get 8 out of 9, but he's still there. He said on 9 of 9, he wasn't quite there. So, but I appreciated that, right? Even though we didn't agree, it is helpful for him to be able to recognize it's not like these things are. It's not that there aren't some real positive virtues at a minimum in committed same-sex relationships. Now, that alone does not necessarily mean that someone may not have other reasons for believing that that is not something that they should affirm, but I think it is still helpful to be able to get to a place of recognizing we can at least acknowledge, no matter what position someone takes at the end of the day, that there are positive virtues that we see in many committed same-sex relationships. So to have at least some recognition of that can be helpful.
And in some ways, that's sort of maybe even the beauty of a lot of what's changed in the last 10 years too, is that the more proximity that there is to folks that are not just LGBTQ, but actually like in really healthy relationships, et cetera, it sort of helps kind of move that needle a little bit just based on personal experience.
Right.
You can't perpetuate stereotypes if you see different examples.
Yeah. And then in terms of helping your not accepting family come to a place where we can agree to disagree.
Agree to disagree. Yeah.
Again, there's only so much you can do, right? You could make the best case possible for why that should be able to be possible. And it's still up to the other person whether they are willing to approach it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I do think things that are helpful is to be able to, especially early on in coming out to a family member, if the number one concern of theirs is about faith, which for most of us, that's the case, I think it can be really helpful to be very clear about all of the things as a Christian that you do continue to believe and affirm. So yes, you've changed your mind on this topic, but you continue to believe that Jesus was divine, that he
Yep.
died for your sins, that you still place your trust in Jesus. You continue to believe that the Bible is the inspired and authoritative word of God. You just interpret some passages in it differently on this topic, right?
Mm.
I think that is helpful. It will not necessarily, but I think there are many people for whom that at least makes them feel like, okay, I'm still concerned that I think my child is very wrong on this topic, but we have some common ground still in that my child has not walked away from Jesus.
Yeah.
So I think being able to emphasize the things that you do continue to share in common can be helpful.
We got a good one in the chat. Here's a question. What would you say to a person when they try to use, quote, a man should not lie with another man, because that has always been used as a prominent argument?
Yes, and so that's just from Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. I think the main thing to be aware of is that those verses are part of the Old Testament law code, and that law code has never applied to Christians. So the Old Testament has 613 rules, regulations, and prohibitions, and those two in Leviticus are two of the 613. But much of the New Testament is focused on the fact that Christ's atoning work on the cross has liberated Christians from what Paul called the yoke of slavery that was the Old Testament law code. And this was the first big decision of the early church, as narrated in Acts 15, that do Gentile converts to the law have to follow the entire law to be saved? And they concluded no. There's huge discussion right throughout the New Testament. This is one of Paul's main emphases, is that we are not saved by works, and that Gentile converts to the faith do not need to follow all these 613 rules. Now, that does not mean that the Old Testament law is not important. It is important, and there's a lot that we can learn from it, and we should study it. And there are plenty of things in the Old Testament law that are consistent with Christian attitudes and beliefs. But there are also many things in the Old Testament law that don't transfer in a one-to-one way to Christians. And so even though we should continue to study and learn from it, there are still many examples. Even in that same chapter, it says that sex during a woman's menstrual period is prohibited, and any couple who does this is supposed to be cut off from their people. That's not seen as a sin issue by Christians today. It's seen as a TMI issue, right? It's to the extent anybody would start sharing that, people would be like, you didn't need to tell me that, right? Like, that's not seen as an ethics issue. It's just kind of a private question.
Yeah.
How people, how people feel about that. And again, that doesn't mean that those verses aren't valuable too, but it's to put them in their appropriate context and to recognize that Christians have never been bound by the Old Testament law. It has never applied to Christian believers in the way that it did to the ancient Israelites.
Okay, let's take it real personal. And if you want to apply heady theology to it, you're welcome to, or you can
Oh,
go for it.
I did see one other question about this
Oh,
same
yeah,
topic.
go for it. Yeah.
Follow up from somebody says, but historically, isn't that Leviticus passage referencing pedophilia and not consensual adult relationships? So I have seen this argument. This argument has gained some traction on TikTok and Instagram. And I do not think that Leviticus is specifically limited to pedophilia. So the language that it is using is about males, just males broadly. So while it would include pedophilia for sure, it is not limited to pedophilia. I do think that the text of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 is a categorical prohibition specifically of male same-sex anal intercourse. That's the specific same-sex act. There's nothing that's said about female same-sex relations, and there's nothing that's said, even though the Talmud, an early centuries AD Jewish document, actually differentiated between different types of male same-sex acts. And it basically said that the non-penetrative acts were not seen as big of a deal. They were all seen as negative, right? None of them were being encouraged, but there was a specific focus on a penetrative act in Leviticus 18:22. I think the best understanding of that contextually is rooted in the fact that ancient Israel was part of the ancient world, which was deeply patriarchal, in which women were seen as having fundamentally less value than men and as being inferior in value to men. In that context, for a man to be seen as taking the quote unquote woman's role in sex was to be seen as taking on the lower status of a woman and therefore degrading his masculine honor. So the question we have to ask as Christians is that whole question of the superiority of men over women should that be understood in a similar way to how Christians have long understood issues like slavery and polygamy, which are reflected and show up in different ways in the Bible, but we recognize that God was working within flawed institutions and not necessarily endorsing them for all time. In fact, Jesus says something very similar when he's asked about divorce and how the Old Testament allowed divorce for more reasons. And he said, well, Moses gave you that law because your hearts were hardened. And so Jesus himself recognizes that there are laws in the Old Testament that are kind of there for a time based on cultural norms that may be a reflection of things that are part of the fall and not actually things that are always meant to be. So if we as Christians, as I do believe, that men and women have equal value and that the ways that we see the differences in value kind of show up in the biblical backdrop and biblical context, that's the same way we should look at something like slavery or polygamy. That was part of the fall. It was not a good thing. It's part of just the way that the world was at the time. But if you look especially to a lot of the teachings in the New Testament that point us beyond that, that point us to the equality of men and women, then that is why the Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 verse would not carry the same weight for Christians today, because kind of similar to the allowance of divorce for a much broader range of reasons in the Old Testament. But I don't think that it's limited to pedophilia specifically.
That makes sense. I like Todd's question. Let's take a swing at that one, a little more personal. Our daughter knows that we love her and are now affirming of her sexual orientation. We talk a lot with her and share things we learn from both of you and others. What more can we be doing to encourage her to consider re-engaging in her faith?
Oh, it's a great question, and it's hard because for a lot of people who have been hurt deeply by the church, a lot of people do need time.
Yep.
And so it's not something that can be forced. I think all you can, and I think if you try to force it, it can often be counterproductive. I think all you can really do is continue to be examples of actual love. People who your daughter knows are Christians, believe in God, believe in Jesus, and are fully embracing of her and fully love and support her. I think that's the most that you can really do. I mean, maybe, if there were some sermon that you heard that, you thought was so great and was, but even then, there are a lot of people who don't want to hear a sermon on a random topic, because in the back of their mind, they're going to think, oh no, the other shoe's going to drop at some point, and then this pastor is going to say something negative about me.
Totally.
I think overall, it's mostly just staying in that relationship and making sure that you are an example of, like, a positive Christian example in your child's life, and hope that in time that will help them be able to.
Yep. And even just trusting that. I've done some really good work with Embracing the Journey, which, if you're not familiar, is just a fantastic organization that is, very theologically neutral intentionally, because they want to be able to reach lots of families to reconcile with their kids. And that's the biggest fear of parents, is when their kids come out, is like, will they lose their faith? And just that journey of you just got to trust that, you being Jesus, things will come around when they're supposed to come around. You can't force that. And if you try to force it, it kind of does the opposite.
Right. This is a good one from Phil Nixon. What advice do you give to LGBTQ Christians who have remained in a church to try to support a conversation around visibility and inclusion, but also need to balance this with finding an environment where they themselves feel accepted and loved by their church community and able to grow in their faith?
100%.
Great question. And I would never say that, even though so much of what we do with the Reformation Project is focused on engaging and reaching people who are not affirming, I don't think that it is every person's responsibility, or that it is even a good idea for every person to try to remain in a non-affirming community while doing that. I think that it is kind of a gift that some people have, and that other people may have different gifts that are not that. And it also can be about different seasons in your life. There are some people who have that gift now, but would not have been able to do it 10 years ago or 5 years ago, because they might have been in a place where things were too fresh or too raw. So I think that the most important thing is to make sure that your own faith is being nurtured and supported, right? So if you're in a church where you just feel like you don't feel like you're receiving that support and growth in your faith, because you feel like you're feeling iced out in a somewhat aggressive way based on your views on this topic, I think that may not be the best place, right, to remain. In general, I think it's more moderate, non-affirming churches where it can be the most helpful and fruitful for people who would hold a different view to remain a part of the community. A church that has a very, very strong posture against same-sex relationships is much less likely for that to feel productive and constructive. But either way, I still think I know people who are part of two churches. And if one
One's a
church,
mission field and one's to get what they need, right?
or they're both
Wow.
to support
Yeah.
their faith, but in different ways. And I think that hopefully, ideally, even if you're hoping to reach people, at a church that's not affirming, that you're still able to be growing in your faith in various ways, right? That hopefully you're
Yeah.
still really gleaning things from the sermons, you're able to be participating in various things through relationship, Bible study, all of those things. So that it should be a kind of two-way
Yeah,
a two-way
absolutely.
street, ideally.
That's been the case for me for sure. Like I came out of the evangelical church and I've stayed in it, but in some respects, like I kind of saw the church as it could be, so I really
Right.
I found my identity and my belonging and my community in the church, right? But I know that in relation to a lot of my LGBTQ plus family, I'm the exception, right? So I can stay in that environment and help productive conversations because I never was wounded in that environment. If I was, it was more subversive, right? I
Right.
don't where most folks, I would encourage them to just go where you can build your faith in a safe place. And then maybe someday you can come back around and help move the needle if you feel so inclined,
I agree. I see a couple questions about New
Yeah,
Testament
we have
passages.
time for one
Okay.
more. So you got
Well,
to
I'll
pick a
put it,
good
well,
one.
they're kind of the same question.
And
Um,
also point people to your resources after you answer that, point people to where they should go to kind of, because some of these
okay.
questions are probably in your video or your book, I'd imagine. But
Yes.
yeah.
So there's just a question about some of the New Testament verses, and Jacqueline
Yeah.
asked, how do you interpret Romans chapter 1? So I'll give you just a little brief overview here. But Gail then points out some resources on the Reformation Project website. We have the biblical case. There's a brief biblical case that's available for free. There's a very extensive 7-hour video curriculum on the biblical case. Where you can get a lot more of these. There's also, my book, God and the Gay Christian. There are other books that we recommend on the website. In a nutshell, so in Romans 1, Paul, this is probably the most significant of all the texts because it's in the New Testament, and it's the longest discussion of same-sex behavior anywhere in Scripture. It's not that long, it's just 2 verses, but it's part of this broader description where Paul's describing people who knew God but turned away from God to worship idols, and then
Yep.
God kind of gave them over to just see what would happen in their lives without keeping God at the center. And it's just a parade of horribles, basically, what goes on in Romans 1.
Right.
And in his discussion of them being given over to lustfulness, he describes them engaging in same-sex behavior. And it's certainly a negative description. I think there's no question that Paul took a negative view of same-sex relations in this text. The key question for us as Christians today is not whether Paul took a positive or negative view, but what was behind his thinking. Why did Paul take a negative view of same-sex behavior in Romans 1? And the argument that I put forward that's also laid out in even more exquisite detail in a fantastic book I'd recommend called Bible, Gender, Sexuality by a New
Yes,
Testament
you were telling me about that.
named
Yep.
Jim Brownson. It's a really terrific book. He has a 110-page exegesis on Romans 1. It sounds intimidating and it might take a little time, but it's really quite helpful. But my basic argument is that Paul's rejection of same-sex behavior makes a lot of sense in his cultural context, in which the primary forms of same-sex behavior that were practiced and discussed were pederasty, which is this terrible, awful practice of adult men engaging in relationships with adolescent boys, awful, awful. Prostitution, also pretty bad, and sex with people who were enslaved. In all of these cases, who obviously can't even consent because they're enslaved. In all of these cases, these men are either married to women or will be married to women. And their same-sex behavior is just one additional outlet for lustful self-gratification. We see many examples of other even first century contemporary writers to Paul who describe same-sex relations in a similar way to Katy Perry in her 2009 song, I Kissed a Girl, where it's people who get really drunk at a party and they're engorging themselves and overindulging all their appetites for drink, for food, and then they're also going off and even having, one night stands and sleeping around with people of the same sex. In none of these cases are they actually talking about relationships. And in fact, even Paul in Romans 1:31 says that the people he's describing have no fidelity and no love. So so is he talking about loving, faithful, same-sex relationships? Well, by definition, no, because he explicitly says that there's no fidelity and no love. what we need to understand is that it's not about trying to say that, oh, Paul secretly was pro same-sex marriage. No, but just that the forms of same-sex behavior that existed and that were a part of the biblical world, Paul had good reasons to reject that. And that we can actually agree with Paul that the same-sex behaviors that predominated in the ancient world were wrong. They were not things that Christians should be embracing because they're rooted in lustfulness, they're rooted in self-seeking excess, they're rooted in
domination.
as domination and power. The types of relationships that we are talking about today, of same-sex marriages that are between partners who are the same status. It's not like one, dominant person and a subordinate person. Monogamous, covenantal relationships that are seeking to actually live into this core principle of the Bible's teachings on marriage, which is that marriage is supposed to reflect the love of Jesus for his church through the self-giving, self-sacrificial love of the spouses for one another. Well, there are same-sex couples today, and we see them throughout the church who are living that out in their marriage relationships. Those sorts of same-sex relationships are just fundamentally different from anything that existed in the biblical world. And so we can agree with Paul that his negative judgment of same-sex relations in Romans 1 was correct given the same-sex behaviors that existed in the biblical world. He was right to view those things as sinful, self-seeking excess. And the sorts of same-sex marriage relationships that we're talking about today are simply fundamentally different and need to be assessed independently. And we need to assess them. It's not just saying, oh, they weren't discussed, so therefore they're fine, right? An argument from silence is not a complete argument. There are plenty of things that might not have been explicitly discussed, but that we still should not support. But we need to assess them against the backdrop of the Bible's broader teachings about the purposes of marriage and sexuality. And if the core purpose of marriage and sexuality, according to the Bible, is about self-giving covenantal love to reflect God's love for us through Jesus, then same-sex couples are just as capable of reflecting that and of living out that purpose as heterosexual couples are.
Preach. I love it.
So that's just a little
What a great way to end. That was wonderful. Matthew, thank you. We could have gone for another hour. I knew you'd give us great, wonderful, think about the Bible differently, stuff like that, but it was also really fun just to hear your personal story and how you kind of fell into all of this stuff and how it turned into a real mission for you. So thank you. Thank you so much for your work and your passion and being a trailblazer for folks like me. And thank you everybody else for showing up for the call. Appreciate it. We couldn't do this without you. If you had a call to action for folks, Matthew, what would it be? Sorry to put you on the spot.
If you're interested in learning more, you can go to reformationproject.org. You should sign up for our mailing list so you can learn more about it. Our Reconcile and Reform Conference, we haven't officially announced this yet, but I will tell your folks here. Our next conference next year in 2025 is going to be in Atlanta.
Our town.
Many of you are in or near Atlanta. It's going to be the first weekend in October 2nd through the 4th. So we will be announcing that probably in a month or two and opening registration. So cool. If you are interested in that, it's really a wonderful opportunity to get to connect and learn and worship with Christians from around the country and around the world who share those core values of love for God, love for the Bible, love for the church, and want to see the church living into the love of Jesus in a more authentic, full way when it comes to its posture toward the LGBT population. So
I love that.
Yes, we'd love to see people there.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks so much.
See ya.
Bye.
Brian Nitzel is an author, speaker, and thought leader. To learn more, visit makingthingsright.org or follow him on Instagram @Brian Nitzel.